On TV, radio and online, Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good evening and welcome to Neil Oliver Live, with me, Simon Evans, standing in for Neil this week while he takes a break. Coming up tonight on the show, we'll be looking into whether we are turning into a cashless society and what this will mean for the older generations and indeed scaffolders. We will be looking into who can actually afford school fees these days, scaffolders again, and asking if the end is in sight for private education. We will be hearing about a castle in Scotland which could be yours for just £30,000, but there's a catch. It's nothing to do with scaffolding. And I'll be asking why us Brits do love a ruin. All of that and more coming up. But first, an update on the latest news from Bethany Elsie.
Simon, thank you. Here's your top stories from the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has offered his condolences to the families of those killed in a train crash in India. At least 288 people have died and around 850 are injured, making it the country's deadliest rail incident in more than 2 decades. The army has been deployed to help with the search and rescue operations. India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has visited the site in Odisha state.
I am deeply pained. Many passengers from different states have lost something during this journey. The people who have lost their lives. It's beyond sad and very disturbing. The government will leave no stone unturned and will provide the best treatment to the people who've been injured. The relatives who we've lost can't come back, but the government is with their families in this hour of grief.
The Epsom Jockey Club has praised the swift and decisive action of police after they detained 2 protesters at the Epsom Derby as they tried to run on to the course. In total, 31 protesters have been arrested for attempting to disrupt the event, with 12 arrests made at the grounds. Animal Rising had threatened to cancel or severely delay the racing event, but it went ahead as planned. The group has accused Surrey Police of abusing their powers, and Louise Hillwood from the group says they're happy with today's outcome.
That was one of our goals, but the second goal, and probably an extremely important one, is that we wanted to start a national conversation. We wanted people to be talking about what happened today, what happens to the horses in horse racing, but also to animals in other industries, in sport, entertainment, and in our food system.
Thousands of people attending sports and music events have faced major disruption on the rail network today as members of the ASLEF union go on strike. It's the 3rd day of industrial action this week, affecting those travelling to the Epsom Derby and the FA Cup final at Wembley. Staff at 15 train operating companies have walked out in an ongoing dispute over pay and conditions. Philip Schofield says he's afraid to leave his home after admitting to an affair with a much younger male colleague at This Morning. The 61-year-old resigned from ITV and was dropped by his talent agency over the scandal. In a new interview with The Sun, Schofield says he fears being spat on in the street and that he's getting by hour with support from his daughters and friends. Diesel prices fell by a record of almost 12 pence last month, the biggest drop for over 2 decades. The RAC says the average price of diesel went from 158.9 pence to 147p in May. It's the 7th consecutive month in which UK pump prices have fallen, reducing the cost of filling up a typical family car by £6.50. Petrol prices also fell by 3 pence last month. And Manchester City have beaten their rivals Manchester United 2-1 to win the FA Cup final at Wembley. Ilkay Gundogan scored after 12 seconds. That's the fastest goal in FA Cup final history. United's Bruno Fernandes equalised by scoring a penalty at 33 minutes, but Gundogan scored another to restore City's lead 6 minutes into the second half. It means they're now on course to complete what's called the treble, winning the Premier League, the FA Cup and the Champions League in the same season, which takes place next Saturday. You're up to date on TV, online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Now it's back to Simon.
And welcome back to Neil Oliver Live with me, Simon Evans. Extraordinary scenes at the FA Cup final, but I've got nothing to say about that. Given the opportunity to deliver one of these iconic Saturday monologues, I was actually delighted, almost salivating yesterday, to see a story broken in the Telegraph that ministers had a chilling secret unit during COVID to curb lockdown dissent. They apparently flagged perfectly legitimate online conversations about vaccine passports and so on, and what have been proven to be well-founded fears about government policy. They were scrutinising for signs of sedition. This was a cause dear to my heart. The timing seemed almost too good to be true. Well, that story may well stand up, but it's not what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. Instead, I wanted to talk about things that seem too good to be true. Many years ago, possibly inspired by a desire to understand my recent decision to get married and have children, I picked up a book called Irrationality by Stuart Sutherland. This was one of the first of a wave of such titles which have since become a tsunami, a genre often referred to as popular psychology. You'll find these books on the table called Smart Thinking in Waterstones or in your local bookshop, and very tempting they are too. I was for many years borderline addicted. Most of them have been published in the last 20 years, suggesting enormous progress in human understanding in that period. Occasionally, an old pretender like Darwin, Plato or William James will find its way onto that table and then be ushered back out like a shabby, bearded tramp, gate-crashing a Silicon Valley product launch, who later turns out to have been the founder. Sutherland's book introduced me to various flaws, glitches, biases and errors in our thinking that limit the extent to which our brains guide us smoothly through the assault course of life. The rhymer's reason effect, beloved of advertisers. Survivorship bias, beloved of chat shows. The availability heuristic. There is a long list of cognitive biases now on Wikipedia, and fascinating it is too. Indeed, more recent books now with titles like Twitch, What That Annoying Thing in Your Eyelid Is Trying to Tell You, or Spleen, Why Nature's Forgotten Organ Could Hold the Secret to Your Self-Destructive Behaviour, suggest that your brain is barely in charge at all, a figurehead at best, and every bit as apt to stumble up the steps of life as is President Joe Biden. Your gut, for instance, is now thought to be as intelligent as a sheepdog and as desperate to attract your attention as well, and for you to entertain it. One that immediately struck me as describing a very real thing, however, is called confirmation bias. And it is now widely understood to be among the most powerful distortions affecting and hindering our grasp of the modern world. It's why we end up in those notorious echo chambers we hear about, or rather, why everyone else does while we alone roam free. Confirmation bias means that even if we don't actively seek evidence that what we already think is correct, that sort of evidence is all that has a chance of penetrating our thick blocks of wood, our exoskeletons of doubt. Anything that doesn't work with the grain of our pre-existing beliefs has very little chance of getting through. We don't even feel consciously hostile to it. Very often, contrary facts just make us feel tired. Thinking is tiring. It uses a surprisingly large amount of oxygen. The brain is a thirsty organ, I know mine is, and it burns large amounts of calories. Adjusting established beliefs in the face of new evidence sounds like a good habit to adopt, but then so did that gym membership last January, and so did starting every day with a cold shower. We have, instead, evolved various heuristics in the modern parlance, shortcuts essentially, that allow us to sex the newborn chicks of discourse and sort them very quickly into battery or bin. Does this, we ask ourselves, firstly, feel right? As Thomas Gilovich put it, for desired conclusions, we ask ourselves, can I believe this? But for unpalatable conclusions, we must ask, must I believe this? A couple of weeks ago, word went around that John Cleese, now a friend of this very channel, of course, but once upon a time, way back in my youth, a python, the very highest form of comedy life. John was going to remake Life of Brian as a stage show. Good news. But it was reported he was going to bow to shifts in popular taste and loss of appetite for cruelty and humour and remove the famous scene in which his character, Reg, leader of the People's Front of Judea, derides as delusional the determination of his comrade Stan, played by Eric Idle, to be known as Loretta and to have a baby. Where, he wants to know, is the fetus going to gestate? In a box? Well, that now sounds transphobic, of course, and so there was a protest. Did this feel true to me? It did. Could I believe it? Oh, yes. In a world where barely a day goes by without trans activists committing some fresh outrage against common sense, I certainly could. Not only could I believe it, I wrote a perfectly serviceable column about it for Spiked Online. Trans, I wrote, is the new church, and mockery of it the new blasphemy. My tone was elegiac, more disappointed than angry, lamenting the passing of the great British sense of humour and the ridiculous, the body to be cremated and the ashes to be sent God knows where, certainly not Australia. Only trouble was, it wasn't true, of course. Cleese had taken a straw poll of reactions to that scene at the end of the read-through, and that much was true, but he was not himself a straw in that wind. He was amused to see that it made some of his actors uncomfortable, but he was standing firm, and the scene was staying in. Well, it would be tempting at this point to say, "I wider point still stands," something I have nicknamed the pie deflection, after Jonathan Pye, the parody news presenter who was similarly gulled into thinking the worst of Rishi Sunak recently and refused to take the hit. "The fact that I could believe this tells us something in itself," he said. Yes, what it tells us is that we, all of us are fallible, Jonathan, even me, and all vulnerable to wishful thinking. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. The price of self-respect, too. "All lies and jest," sang my namesake, Paul Simon, nearly 60 years ago. Still a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. But the best we can hope to do is be aware that our gut, too, can be terribly mistaken. Good boy, though it's... Well, all of that is my opinion, of course, and you're free to disagree. Keep your tweets and emails coming all the time. You can email gbviews@gbnews.com. You can tweet me as well. GB News, that's at GB News, or you can tweet me directly if you like, at the Simon Evans. Please keep it to the next hour or so. I don't want my feed getting bunged up for the rest of the week off the back of this show. I will try to get some of your comments into the show later on. Joining me throughout the show this evening is the fabulous podcaster Andrew Gold. Andrew, good afternoon, good evening.
Afternoon.
We're right on the cusp of two time periods.
Dusk.
Do you feeling it's a dusk? Yeah, good dusk. That's a nice time to meet people, isn't it? Feels
Lovely.
very homely on the way to the ale house. So what do you make of that little monologue there, that diatribe against confirmation bias? Do you encounter it much?
Oh, yeah. Well, congratulations on a well-delivered and thought-provoking and highbrow
Thank you.
monologue. Fantastic.
It's quite a long period to get through in one go. It started to feel quite unnatural.
I felt stressed for you. Wow. Doing this is no easy job.
But I was floated back to my kitchen, explained to my wife how the dishwasher should be stacked.
The sheepdog and my gut are the same intelligence. That's quite incredible.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? And what your gut lacks, of course, is any means of communication other than the fairly, vulgar.
Yeah, mine's doing it a little bit right now. Well, I the confirmation bias all the time. And one of my former guests on my podcast was Peter Boghossian, the academic.
Oh, you've had him on? Great.
Yeah, he's brilliant, and he does something called street epistemology, and he goes to people, and it's a really wonderful exercise where he says, OK, this is what you think. Do you think a trans woman is a woman, for example?
Yeah.
And how strongly do you believe that? And they might say, I believe that 8 out of 10. And he says, what would it take to get to 7?
Yeah.
I find that really fascinating because we don't engage that part of our mind enough. And so often that's what I think debate should be about.
And that is, I mean, he is a very intelligent guy, and he was also quite brave. He was along with James Lindsay, wasn't he?
Yes.
And Helen...
Oh.
Yeah, anyway, those three, they did the scam on academia. They exposed it at a time when it was still quite dangerous, potentially, to go there, and it's becoming more mainstream now. But even so, you can also see how what he's doing there is a bit like a Chris Morris sketch as well. He's kind of going, how big is the threat of terrorism? Is it this big? This kind of ludicrous, the exposure of vox pops and the limitations of them. I do think that there is a tendency, and in a way it's what I wanted to go over in that monologue, that we learn about these heuristics, we learn about our cognitive biases, and then we carry on making them. It's almost impossible to actually avoid it. If you do take a step back, you can sometimes think, hang on. But actually, in the flow of life, you can read as many books about it as you like. You will remain the person you are.
Yeah, it's very hard to change. But you do change, don't you? You don't have the same views you had 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
I suppose when the evidence mounts up, eventually things change, don't they? And I suppose that's what happened. Gradually, societal shifts. I mean, at the moment, we're going through a few, aren't we? And some of them are possibly reversals of... I think a lot of campaigning seems to be based on the idea that, they say now 3.5% of particularly annoying people, if they all act in sort of concord together, can affect giant changes in society. But I begin to wonder if that actually holds true, or whether actually after a while society begins to push back.
Yeah, I remember reading recently, I think it's James Hewitt or James Marriott in The Times. He wrote about this, and he was saying people are no longer so scared of Twitter mobs. We finally started to realise when Twitter came along 10, 15 years ago, we were so worried about a pile-on. Companies really worried about, brands. And now we realise it's actually a tiny percentage of just very angry people. It doesn't make any difference to sales.
I made a joke on a radio programme went out last weekend. It sounded as if it was at the expense of people who have long COVID, although it was intended to be slightly more nuanced than that. But they are, understandably, a very vocal bunch. They are quite well organised, and they do feel they've been ignored and belittled. And so I got a pile-on. And it's not a pleasant thing to wake up to on a Sunday morning.
It's not nice.
But I also do recognise what you're saying, that people know now you will come through this. You'll come out the other side. The thing to do is, of course, close your Twitter. Yeah,
well, the worst thing to do is to apologise, because then they jump more, and the apology is never enough. The frustrating... I get people saying transphobe, right? And I'm not a transphobe, obviously. I just don't believe in some of the things that are being said.
The nonsense,
Well, but I'm careful. I'm careful.
Joking.
And yet what's the frustrating part is... They then message and tweet to guests that I want to get on. I wanted to get Leah Remini, the King of Queens actress who was a former Scientologist, to talk about Scientology. So I'm tweeting with her, and underneath all these people going, well, you shouldn't go on his thing. He's a transphobe. And I'm like, well, that's defamatory, really. It's interfering with my work.
I've seen that as well. There's an MP who, long story that I happen to know vaguely, called Jesse Norman, who's written a book. And I've thought the book is about Francis Bacon, the sort of Elizabethan rivalry he had with Edmund Cook, and any time I speak to him about it, good, see you've got this book review and stuff, somebody comes in and goes, when are you going to sort out the rivers? It's like the River Wye is full of filth. It is extraordinary. I mean, you have to learn how to use Twitter. You have to learn how to use social media generally. You have to recognise that if you just, go with the flow, you will end up in places you don't want to end up in.
Yeah.
I think that's something that I've come to recognise over the time I've been on it. It started off feeling much more like a sort of Sunday afternoon in a saloon bar, having a couple of quiet pints with some mates. And nowadays you realise your following goes up and you have responsibilities.
I hardly even bother with the Twitter anymore now, because it does feel like it's gone a bit out of fashion. Maybe that's just
You must promote your podcast on it, right?
Less and less. I don't even bother. And that's partly because of YouTube's discoverability. I've come to realise that all the going on someone else's podcast, unless it is Joe Rogan, all that stuff, does very little.
Okay.
If you put out a really good video, that's the best possible thing, because it just goes mad in the algorithm, and that's how you get new subscribers.
OK. Well, that's useful information to know as well.
Start a channel.
OK, coming up, a pensioner is forced to retire from tennis because her local leisure centre will not accept cash. Will cash last the decade? See you in a couple of minutes.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive, because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Neil Oliver Live with me, Simon Evans. Is cash king? Well, not for pensioner Juliet Casciano. The 80-year-old has been forced to retire from her love of tennis because her local sports centre does not take cash. Sounds like a racket to me. Juliet had wanted to get back on court after taking 7 months off bed rest following a second hip replacement operation. You would think that we would be encouraged to get our old people back on their feet, but no. Many people will welcome the inevitable move to a cashless society and would argue it has already helped shorten supermarket queues and indeed unsightly pocket bulges. But others, like Juliet and several Harry Enfield characters from the 1980s, feel they are being left behind. There is also the question of whether it gives the state more power. We've already seen evidence of that when Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau froze the bank accounts of truckers who were protesting vaccine mandates. He couldn't have done that if they had taken cash. I'm joined now by banking and payments consultant Bob Liddon. Hello, Bob.
Hi.
How are you?
Hello. I'm well, very well.
Excellent.
Up here in Norfolk, we still use cash a lot.
Are you? That's interesting. Where in Norfolk are you?
Wells next the sea.
Oh, beautiful. Absolutely good.
Yeah.
I would imagine you still take groats up there. But it's interesting you mentioned that. My parents, before I start with the scripted questions, my parents actually live in Norfolk. They live in a place called Tackleston, about 10 miles south, near Attleborough. You probably know that part of the world. And they were actually complaining to me recently that I think Attleborough and Wyndham are losing all their cash points and they now have to travel a 24-mile round trip to Norwich to get cash out.
Yes, that's right. And that's, it's a knock-on from the closure of branches. Because bank branches go, the cash machine go, and that's the slippery slope, which has never been challenged by government, despite many pressure groups saying this is no good. But the problem is the government actually agrees with it all. From the top down, the very top, Mr. Stanford University, Rishi Sunak, believes in tech, he believes in fintech, digital payments. And it's his mandate under which the Bank of England are looking at what they call the digital pound, which would replace all of this, replace cash machines and make everything work somehow. They're not quite sure how it's going to work, but nevertheless, just trust us and everything will be fine. That's the message.
Do you feel it's a sort of philosophical position, almost like a disposition, a sentimental attachment that certain people have to everything going digital as a sort of fundamental proposition?
Well, no, it's, you see, cash, you can use it to buy your leg without anybody.
OK, I'm afraid, rather ironically, our digital connection there, as though to demonstrate the unreliability of the digital world, if we'd had him here in physical form, like cash, we'd have been fine at it. What do you think about this? I mean, you're a young person, obviously, younger than me, still got your hair. You might be the same age. If you've got your hair, that's how you get away with it.
Yeah.
I do sometimes wonder whether it is just a generational thing that we all have. We come into the world when there's a certain sort of set of parameters that dominate. There are certain conventions that seem normal to us, but perhaps aren't normal at all. Perhaps in 10 or 15 years, we'll wonder why we ever thought it was more sensible to walk around with these strange papery plastic tokens.
Yeah, I think that it. I don't know if I'm young. I'm 34, so I'm teetering over the edge of that, and I am very much of a sort of everything in moderation kind of person. So I can see how it's moving very fast for people from a different generation. It might be difficult for them. At the same time, I wonder if we condescend a little bit. I've just done an interview with Richard Dawkins. I think he's 83.
Yeah.
He popped over for the podcast. He's got his own podcast coming out. He's looking at the cameras and stuff.
Yeah.
You can use a card. Now, he's particularly intelligent, OK?
Yeah.
But I spoke to my dad about this before as well.
He's intelligent and also, sorry to interrupt, but he's well-funded, isn't he? There are some people who struggle a little bit possibly to adapt in terms of intelligence or you know, just age, but also who, you know, might find it expensive to actually be able to adopt all these new measures. You know?
Well, it's just sort of... Well, I might not be fully understanding it, because as far as I can, you know, debit card, you go and pay for something and you go beep.
Yeah.
What's the difficulty?
Oh, well, if it's something that takes a debit card, there's no difficulty. But, for instance, my parents, who, as I say, are complaining now, they struggle to get cash. They have a cleaner who comes once a fortnight, and she wants to take cash, not least because she doesn't always charge the same amount. She might get there and go, well, this is going to be 3 hours' work, or I've done some ironing for you. So they could set up a direct debit. They could, do you know what I mean? But actually, these things are quite difficult once you're in your 80s. It is, you know, some of these things are intimidating. And also they have a gardener and all that sort of thing as well. I mean, I'm making them sound like they're living a nice, plush, middle-class lifestyle, but they either would have a gardener or they would disappear like Sleeping Beauty behind the rose bushes quite quickly. But... I mean, there is also, I think, you know, I don't know if this is the elephant in the room or whether people are avoiding talking about it, but I think there is a temptation to avoid the... Some people prefer cash because they can avoid paying tax, right? You get in the builders, you might have 2 or 3 grand's worth of work done, and you might think, how much can we, you know, and I suppose legitimately that is a concern to the government.
Well, exactly, and that's one of the main things that's going to change. But then, as you were saying, that Trudeau stuff is spine-tingling, you know, thinking about that. Oh, my... That he was... I couldn't believe that, and I can't believe that hasn't been spoken about more, that he just stopped people having money just because he didn't agree with their politics.
Having their money, and also there were a lot of attempts to raise money for them. There were plenty of people in America who saw that they were kind of heroes over the border and they had GoFundMes or whatever, and those were all cancelled. And then some of the charities, I'm getting down a slightly different rabbit hole, but this did happen. Some of the platforms that had raised money, the Just Giving, or I don't know which ones it was, decided which alternative good causes that money would go to, because it wasn't going to the truckers. That struck me as absolutely extraordinary. But equally, I mean, there's a podcast, you probably know if you're a podcaster, called Trigonometry.
Yes.
And they recently had their bank account closed because the bank disagreed with the tenant, and they are far from extremists by any... I mean, they are very much in line with GB News' kind of approach to discourse.
Was that PayPal, or was it...
It wasn't PayPal, but it was something, I cannot remember the name.
Some digital.
It was one of those slightly trendy banks that will try and make out that they're actually a slightly, like a happier, smoother, funnier, more like a friend you go for a walk in the park with, and they just happen to have a, credit facilities.
Smiley ones.
And it turns out they're always the sinister ones, this is the thing. So what do you think? I mean, I do remember there was a famous joke that went around in the 70s, I was a kid at the time, decimalisation in about 1971, and what everyone said was they should have waited till all the old people had died. And of course that was the same with Brexit. But I do wonder whether it is just one of those things we're going to have to adapt to. Do you think it'll last a decade, Cash, in any form at this point?
Maybe a few years. I don't know enough about it really, except to say it seems in my fairly young mind to make sense that we would, that we would use card. It's so much easier. I do worry though about the privacy concerns and what government, like the power they have.
Yeah. Well, I will be one of those left bereft, I know. I still remember the good old days. You could do the double at the Comedy Store, double at the Banana and walk home with 800 quid in your pocket. But there we are. Happy days. Joining me after the break, Christopher McGovern, the chairman of the Campaign for Real Education, who believes the private school system is in serious danger of collapse as fees continue to rise. Be back in a couple of minutes.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
The Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate. Both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political budgets.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
And welcome back to Neil Oliver Live with me, your cash-only host, Simon Evans. It looks likely that soon only the super rich will be able to afford to give their children private education. That's under proposals by Sir Keir Starmer and a future Labour government. When people Think of private education. Many already, of course, picture toffs in top hats attending elite schools such as Eton and St Paul's. But thousands of slightly less prestigious and slightly less expensive schools will also be affected. Labour says adding VAT will raise about £1.6 billion a year to help recruit more staff in vital subjects such as maths and physics in the state sector, though we all know that's not how tax works. But will all those independent schools even survive to pay their tax? Many parents are already struggling to cover the fees. Might they not just give up entirely? What then? To discuss this, I'm joined by Chairman of the Campaign for Real Education, Chris McGovern. Hello, Chris.
Hi there. Hi.
So we've got a good signal, good camera angle. We're confident this conversation is going to see its full length spread out before it. Before I start, and for those who might not be familiar with it, can you give us a very brief and succinct summary of what the Campaign for Real Education regards as real education?
Well, the Campaign for Real Education started in the 1980s, and we were set up originally to defend grammar schools. But essentially, we believe in education that actually educates. So, for example, we were very strong from the beginning and teaching children phonics, which has been in the news quite recently. Our arguments proved to be right after sort of 50, 60 years. We believe in a more traditional approach to education, similar to the ones which perhaps you get in countries such as Singapore or in Shanghai in China or Japan, a more traditional approach, which was common here in the 50s. You know, we're the only country in the developed world where grandparents outperform their grandchildren. So yes, we believe in learning your tables and doing a bit of rote learning occasionally, and we believe in the teacher at the front of the class rather than teachers wandering between different tables and so forth. So parental choice, more traditional approach, and really when we say real, we mean an approach that works so that our kids actually can compete with the best.
Well, you've sold me. Absolutely on board with all of that. So presumably you don't have a strong moral position on independent schooling one way or the other in terms of the privilege and so on it bestows and whether that's good. It's more a question of what those schools offer in terms of an actual education.
Absolutely. You know, we're non-political. We tend to be seen as being more on the right, but actually, you know, I served on the TUC, so I don't call that particularly right wing. We favour equality. And what I would say, you know, in this country, and I've talked about this in the Oxford Union and several Cambridge Union, there's a divide, but it's not really between private sector and the state sector. It's a divide between good schools and inadequate schools. And if you've got a lot of money, yeah, you can go to a private school. Or you can buy a house in the catchment area of a good state school. So
yes,
we have good schools.
Right.
And we have, that's the problem.
Privilege comes in many flavours, doesn't it? So how is this VAT charge likely to affect private schools? Presumably, some of them will not be able to maintain their sort of supply and demand intersection is going to suffer, right?
Yeah, it's not all top hats and toffs at private school, believe me. There are some schools like that, and they're very successful. They will survive, of course. I mean, your Etons and your St Paul's and so forth, they're going to survive. But there's a lot of schools which are more middle of the road. Sometimes they serve children with special needs, and they're really they have tight budgets. And if you add 20% VAT to the fees, they will close. And what's going to happen is you're going to have some schools paying VAT to the government, but you're going to have a mass exodus of children also entering state schools. So what you save on the one hand, you lose on the other hand. So it's really the politics of envy, and it's really depressing to think that we have here some great schools. They should stay open, and we should respect parental choice. What we should be worried about is the fact that if you lived in a deprived area of Britain, you're 27 times more likely to go to a failing school than if you live in a posh area. That's the divide. So we should forget about this business of closing private schools. We want to make state schools better so that children will not need to go to private schools. And, you know, if you go back to the 50s and 60s, many private schools were withering on the vine because grammar schools were doing a great job and private schools were less necessary. Now, we are pro-grammar schools, but we're also pro-technical schools. We think we want a restoration of lots of grammar schools, and we want very good, gold standard quality technical schools alongside, perhaps from the age of 13, so that children do not see going to a non-grammar school as a failure. You go to countries such as Switzerland or Germany, they have grammar schools, and they also have technical schools, and there's no difference in terms of the prestige. And in fact, you know, if you go to a technical school and come out as a plumber or an electrician, you're probably going to get a job you paid a lot of money, whereas if you go to an academic school, maybe you won't be, because you may get a job like me as a historian. You know, I didn't get paid much for that. or a teacher. They don't get paid a lot for that. So it's a nonsense in our country that we value only the academic. The academic's important, and private schools are pretty good at that, but also we want very good quality technical schools, whether they're private or whether they're state. We should focus on quality of schools, not whether they're private or independent. We should applaud the private sector. They're doing a great job on the whole.
And can I ask whether you have any sense of how the demographics might change within the schools as well? Because I know already private schools attract a lot of children from overseas, many of them, of course, board. Many parts of the world, the English private education sector is still regarded as very prestigious, and especially in the rising economies in the East. Are they likely to take up the places which local struggling parents in this country are unable to afford?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, look, I spent half my career teaching in the state sector in big comprehensive schools, and the second half in the private sector. I can guarantee that if the places aren't taken up by British parents, they'll be taken up by parents from overseas. You know, we as a campaign often say, for example, if you go to Singapore, you go to Shanghai, they're brilliant education systems. But if you've got a lot of money in Singapore and in Shanghai, you send your kids to England, to the best private schools. So we should be really proud of those schools. And absolutely, at the moment, private schools have to turn down overseas applicants because they've got to maintain some sort of balance. But if you turn away English, we're going to build the economies of our rivals. We're going to have the kids coming here, and they're going to do very well. It's really masochistic.
Maybe we should insist. Maybe what we should do is insist if your child is educated in a British private school, they have to stay here and work here for 10 years afterwards in order to feed their intelligence and their education back into the soil of the British ecology. What do you think?
Well, look, we don't believe in too much statism, so we probably wouldn't go for that. But I'm sympathetic with the idea. We want people who are educated here to feed back into the economy. But look, we're not going to be Big Brother.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's marvellous chatting to you, and I see you're an East Sussex man, so hopefully we'll catch you for a pint at some point when I'm back down in Hove very soon. Take care. Thank you. Andrew, I don't know, do you have children yourself?
No, not yet.
No, OK. I mean, we have a couple and we've put them through private education, and it's something I almost feel embarrassed talking about on here, you know, but it's absolutely ruinously expensive. I am not entirely convinced it was the best use of the money, but there it is, it's done. But you do feel that you're caught now in a double bind because on the one hand, it's already horrendously expensive. It's going to get more expensive. And at the same time, your children are then, I think, persecuted to some extent. The same grades when they come out of sixth form at A level will not be given the same offers as if they were to have those grades coming out of state school. The adaptation is being made by the higher education. So it feels like there's a real squeeze going on.
It's a really difficult one, isn't it? I went to a private school myself, and I also have that embarrassment sometimes of saying it, as if like that everything was handed to you. And in reality, in my experience anyway, we weren't very different to friends of mine who went to grammar schools and state schools. We're just... And Michael McIntyre went to my school.
Right.
So he's
you do remind me of him.
Well, I'm not as posh as him, though. But he's very quite posh and all that, but he's very relatable. That's the whole point of his comedy, isn't it? He can relate to the average person.
You know, the one thing that everyone says about private education, including people who went to it and who were convinced, because I didn't, I was state educated, but the one thing people talk about is the confidence you come out with.
Yes.
Not better educated in an academic sense, but you have a way of bearing. And that seems to be largely amount, you know, of drama. You know, they do a little bit more public speaking. They tend to spend their weekends either putting on musicals or, of course, they play a bit more sport. I think those two things between them, you know, it actually isn't that complicated.
The years of rugby and all those kinds of things, team sports and those things, you probably feel a bit special. I don't know. But what I was saying about Michael McIntyre, the point was back then it wasn't a huge difference. And now, if you're going to charge that much for schools, the people who go to these private schools are not going to be able to be relatable. And then you've got to wonder, is it good to send my kids there if they're so different from the rest of society?
There is a possible way around it, which I think would smooth over this. The one thing you don't want to have in society is significant step changes between the haves and the have-nots. You want a smooth landscape. One thing that would smooth the landscape out would be to have a voucher system whereby every child... It costs roughly $6,000 a year to educate a child in the state sector. Very roughly, but roughly. And about 4.5 at primary school, but in the comprehensive schools. If you were to be given a voucher for $6,000 for every child you have that's hitting state school age, and then you can choose to spend it at your local state school and you pay nothing more, or you pay it towards your fees if you wanted them to go to a slightly better school. Then you would have, you know, a range of schools with a range of facilities. You would have the kind of facilities that $18,000 a year might pay for. If you're really flush, you can go for the $40,000 a year school. But if you only want to just top it up a little bit and just say, I want them to have like a nice education with some playing fields next to the school, maybe that would be $12,000 a year. You might be able to find the extra. Do you know what I mean? That would just smooth things out a bit. Well, enlightened education, what are the chances? Finally, after the break, we'll be chatting to Drew Ratter, who is treasurer of Brough Lodge Trust in the Shetland Islands, where a castle is on the market for just 30 grand. That's 5 years of state school. There is a catch. Don't go away. See you in a minute.
On Mark Dolan tonight, in My Big Opinion, the government silenced COVID critics during the pandemic. Is anyone surprised? Plus, as the excellent UK-Australia trade deal kicks in, Brexit Britain is proving the doubters wrong. My Mark Meets guest is the extraordinarily brave war hero Craig Harrison, famous for the longest sniper shot in the world, 2.5 kilometres. Talk about hitting the targets. In my take at 10, the Harry and Meghan brand is in free fall. If you bought shares in this self-absorbed duo, I would advise you to sell, sell, sell. Plus US news with American showbiz queen Kinsey Schofield, my top pundits, tomorrow's papers, and Harry Redknapp live on the show, discussing the FA Cup final and why Just Stop Oil are targeting professional sport. We're live from 9 till 11 on GB News.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
And welcome back to Neil Oliver Live with me, Simon Evans. The British love a ruin. Many of our favourite buildings, and some would say favourite TV presenters, are craggy remains of former glories. Whether the abbeys left open to the skies like broken molars in the aftermath of Thomas Cromwell's sucker punch, or the castles that once projected power into the darkest corners of the kingdom and now lie quiet at sunset like old warriors dozing by the fire. They capture something of the deep time that our nation embodies, echoes of our uniquely glorious, colourful and eventful island story. And there is something too very pleasing in watching the gradual process of nature reclaiming quarried stone, winding her leaf and branch around the once proud turrets and slowly returning them to her bosom. Even an old tractor on a country ramble is often picturesque, flaking paint, iron dissolving into rust, and old rubber become a nest for beetles, birds or mice. A reassuring reminder that all things must pass, especially when certain things in life seem to be outstaying their welcome. So yes, I love a ruin. Still, I'm not sure I'd want to live in one. That leads me on to my next story. A castle in Shetland is on the market for just £30,000. Andrew, what do you think? Would you fancy living in a castle?
It's not for me, is it? You do get these people. My fiancée and I are getting married, and we've been looking around a few castles, and you get these quite eccentric people who live in them, you know, and if they've just lived there for like 30 years. And they're quite sort of well-spoken, posh, funny eccentrics, you know. There
was a famous family, I can't remember, but the Fullinghams or something like that, they lived in a castle in Devon. They were famous because they swore extraordinarily freely, even the children. There were about 8 children riding around on tractors in the grounds and so on. They became national heroes for a while. I think they had their own series. But yeah, they couldn't afford to heat, you know, 3/4 of the place. It was all turning to mould. Then again, there are other people. There was a chap called Roger Deakin, who was a nature writer. He died quite young, sadly, but he was the inspiration and the sort of great hero of Robert Macfarlane, who's become the doyen of nature writers now. And he wrote a book called Waterlogue, which started the whole wild swimming craze in the UK. He was a real eccentric. He renovated an old farmhouse near Diss in Suffolk, and he lived in the Inglenook fireplace while he was doing it up. I mean, it was a complete ruin. And he even then only did it up to the extent that it became basically windproof and weatherproof. But he didn't clear out the bats or the owls or the mice or any of it. You know, when he had it, you know, building regulations came to investigate it, they said, you've got a family of owls living in the attic. It was like, yes, isn't it marvellous? You know, I have some real respect for eccentrics who can live like that. I suppose my wife would probably have something to say about it. I don't know. The island of Fetlar, incidentally, where this castle is of particular interest to ornithologists, it seems. This is up in Shetland. It's home to a wide variety of bird life, including one of Britain's rarest breeding birds, the red-necked phalarope, as well as whimbrels, red-throated divers, golden plovers, eider ducks, Arctic skuas and Arctic terns, amongst many others. I'll be honest, I feel sorry that Neil himself is not here to wax lyrical on all those names. That's 30 grand they want for Brough Lodge. I mean, that is the price of a flat, but they reckon it will cost about 12 million to do it up and make it what the owners imagine it could be. I mean, and who is then going to go and spend, I don't know, how many residents you'd need to keep ticking over to...
Yeah. Do you remember in Italy they had that? They had a whole community of homes where they were saying basically they were available for €1 or something. Right. But people had to go in and do them up. Yeah. So they didn't actually get snatched up that fast because people don't want to have to do that.
No, that's right. I mean, every so often you see them destroying, just demolishing chateaux in France that people can't afford to keep up. I would have thought with the modern craze for glamping, that would be the obvious thing. This which I don't know whether we've got a photograph of it, but I have seen it online. The walls are established, but the roof has come down, basically. Well, you could glamp inside that, couldn't you? You get a few bell tents, you know, and then you get a couple of bands playing there, and obviously you're not going to be troubled by police as well. So it has some of the appeal of a yacht. You know what I mean? Where you can, you know, what did Frankie Boyle said? You know, I love this routine. He said that however expensive your yacht is, it's never going to be much more comfortable than being in a Premier Inn during a mild earthquake. But what it is it's a mobile crime scene. Yeah. You can do anything you want on a yacht and get away with it. Well, I think this lodge is probably similar.
I think it's a good idea. You've got quite a few ideas. I like all this, the education and this. People can start glamping in castles.
Yeah, I would love to. I would really like to retire up. I do have friends who I stay with when I do the Edinburgh Festival who also have property on the Isle of Shetland, and its main economy, Shetland now, is, of course, as you can imagine, what is a brand name for mini horses, right? Yeah, yeah. Shetland horses are bred on the Isle of Shetland, and it's a bit like Champagne and Stilton. They're only allowed to call them Shetland horses if they come from Shetland. and then they put them in crates and they ship them out to wealthy families in America who want to give their little daughters 6 or 7 years of age, they give them a little mini Shetland pony. They absolutely love it, sell well cartoons. And then the Shetland pony experiences the lovely mild climate of Indiana or whatever it is, and they become horribly ill, and they get diabetic and metabolic disorders, and they keel over and die.
It sounded like you were quite happy.
Horrific, because the Shetland ponies are just used to living in the hideous conditions of northern Scotland.
Very sad.
That's all we have time for. You've been watching Neil Oliver Live with me, Simon Evans. Thanks to my studio guest and podcaster Andrew Gold. Thank you very much. Good night.
Good evening, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. It does turn quite chilly tonight, but with high pressure in charge, we'll see plenty of sunshine through Sunday and temperatures climbing, particularly in the west. High pressure centre just to the north of us means the wind's still coming in from the northeast, so eastern coast a little bit chilly, but further west temperatures remaining above average for the time of year. So fine end to the day, we will see some low cloud across northeast Scotland and also eastern England feeding slowly back inland, making its way towards the Midlands during the early hours. But there'll be lots of dry weather around, clear skies in the west, and we could see a few shallow mist and fog patches and temperatures dipping into single figures. So yes, a chilly start to Sunday morning, but for many a sunny start. We do have low cloud, central and eastern parts. This slowly burns back towards the coast. I think eastern parts of Scotland, towards the east coast of England, could see some low cloud at times, and with that northeasterly breeze it will be quite chilly, temperatures struggling. Grimsby there 13 degrees, but come further west, temperatures rising into the low 20s. Locally 25 degrees is possible, say for parts of West Wales